Vanessa, Ridgemont Family Court, gallery half full, your lawyer's voice still hanging in the air from 30 seconds before. That's where this starts. You in a charcoal blazer you bought for the occasion, me in the same brown jacket I've worn to every parent-teacher conference for 6 years. You just told a room full of strangers that I was nothing but a washed-up soldier. You said it like it was a fact you'd already had notarized. I didn't argue. I didn't even shift in my seat. I just turned toward the bench and smiled at the judge. Harrison, I said, it's been a while. And Harrison Voss, a man in his 50s now, silver at the temples, a gavel in his hand, he suddenly seemed to forget he was holding, froze. Then he stood up, actually stood, out of his chair, in his own courtroom, and said, "Is that really you?" You didn't know what that meant. You still don't. Not really, not the whole of it. So let me lay it out for you the way I never got to, back when we were married and you'd already decided who I was. You married a man you'd built out of the parts you found convenient, quiet, steady, good with our daughter, forgettable at dinner parties. You never asked what 14 years in the army actually cost, or what it built in a person. You assumed a soft voice meant a small man. You called me washed up in front of a judge because in your mind, that's all a soldier becomes once the uniform comes off. Background noise, someone to be managed. You were wrong about that math a long time before you ever said it out loud in a courtroom. Vanessa, you just hadn't been in the room yet when the correction came due. This is that room. Let me tell you what you missed. You never asked what I did over there. Not once, in 9 years of marriage. Did you ask me a single real question about the 2 deployments before I met you, or the training that came after? You knew Army, you knew Ranger, and you filed both under a vague, uncomfortable category you didn't want to open. That was fine by me. At first, some things a person doesn't want to hand to someone who'll flinch. But I noticed, over time, that you weren't avoiding it because it hurt you. You were avoiding it because it didn't interest you. There's a difference, and I felt it every year a little more clearly. You assumed the man teaching shop class at Ridgemont High was the ceiling of my ambition. You'd tell your friends I used to be in the military, past tense, like it was a stop on the way to something smaller. You never asked why a decorated Ranger team leader would choose a classroom full of 16-year-olds over a security contract making 4 times the salary. You never wondered what it meant that men twice my rank still called me on my birthday. You just decided, quietly, that whatever I'd been, I wasn't it anymore, and that made me safe to talk down to. You called me washed up to my face the week you filed. You said it again, softer, to your sister on the phone, not knowing I was in the next room. You said it a 3rd time, loudest, in front of Judge Voss, because you needed the court to see a man too diminished to fight for his own daughter. You built your whole custody argument on the idea that I had nothing left in me. No discipline, no resources, no standing. You assumed a quiet man was an empty one. You never asked about the ledger, either. The nights I sat up grading papers after Lily went to sleep. The 11.5 years I never missed a single support payment. Even the 2 months you took her to your mother's and made it deliberately hard to send it. The teaching certification I finished at night, twice, when the state changed its requirements and you rolled your eyes and said I was still trying to reinvent myself. You never once asked what I was actually building while you were busy deciding I'd already peaked. That's the thing about being underestimated. Vanessa, it gives a man a lot of quiet room to work in. You didn't notice when I started keeping records. Not out of paranoia. Out of habit, the same habit that kept men alive in places you've never had to think about. Every payment, every missed pickup on your end, every night Lily called me crying because you'd promised something and forgotten it. I wasn't building a case against you. I was just doing what I was trained to do, which is notice patterns before they become emergencies. You didn't notice when I finished my 2nd certification, the one in special education, because Lily's school flagged her for extra support. And I wanted to be the parent who understood exactly what that meant instead of the parent who nodded along in meetings. You didn't notice I'd become the coach of the robotics club, or that 3 separate students had put my name on college recommendation forms for reasons that had nothing to do with shop tools. You saw a man teaching teenagers to use a drill press. You never asked what else that man was doing with the other 16 hours of his day. You didn't notice when I reconnected, slowly, with a few names from my old unit. Not for war stories, just for the ordinary reason people who've been through something together stay in each other's lives. One of those names was Harrison Voss. Back then he was a young JAG officer attached to our battalion, green enough that most of the senior guys barely spoke to him. I did. I was the team leader who pulled him out of a vehicle that had taken fire on a road nobody was supposed to be traveling that week, and I stayed with him until the medevac bird came down. He was 26. He went home with a scar and a different relationship to his own mortality, and he went to law school because of it. And he never forgot who'd carried him. We wrote letters for years. Actual letters. You never once asked who I was writing to on Sunday nights. You didn't notice, either, that Harrison had been on the family court bench in Ridgemont for almost 2 years by the time you filed. I didn't request him. I didn't even know until the assignment notice came through with his name printed at the top like it was nothing, like the universe had simply decided to settle in old debt on a random Tuesday. I told my attorney the truth immediately, that I knew the judge, that it needed to be disclosed, that I wanted no advantage bought on a memory. That's the part you'll never understand about men like me. Vanessa, I wasn't hiding a weapon. I was just quietly living a life you decided wasn't worth asking about. So while you were telling your sister I'd never amount to more than a man in a classroom, I was finishing a second degree, keeping a spotless record, and reconnecting with people who remembered exactly what I was capable of long before you'd ever met me. You weren't wrong that I'd changed since the Army. You were wrong about what I'd changed into. You stood at the podium and said it a third time, washed-up soldier, and you smiled while you said it, like the words themselves were a closing argument. Your attorney, Preston Hale, had built the whole strategy around exactly that picture. An unstable, aimless ex-serviceman, unfit for primary custody, a man defined entirely by what he used to be. You believed it so completely that you never thought to ask what would happen if the person deciding Lily's future had ever seen me be anything else. And then Harrison Voss froze. He stood up, in his own courtroom, in front of a gallery that didn't understand what it was watching, and asked if it was really me. And for 3 full seconds, Vanessa, you didn't know what to say. I've replayed those 3 seconds more than I'd like to admit. Your mouth opened. Nothing came out. Preston Hale turned to look at you like you owed him an explanation he hadn't budgeted for. Harrison recovered his composure the way judges are trained to, sat back down, and asked for a brief recess to address a matter of disclosure. Mine, already filed, already on record, already handled cleanly weeks before. When we reconvened, he read a short statement into the record, that he knew me from prior military service, that the connection had been disclosed and reviewed, that he found no conflict requiring recusal, and that the court would proceed on the merits alone. Calm. Procedural. Exactly what it should have been. But the room had already changed, and you felt it. Because for the first time in this entire proceeding, someone in a position of real authority had looked at me. Not the man in the second-hand jacket, not the washed-up soldier from your opening remarks, and recognized someone he'd once trusted with his life. You'd spent months building a story where I had nothing left to stand on. Harrison Voss had just watched that story collapse in real time, without saying a single word about what actually happened on that road all those years ago. Your attorney tried to recover. He pushed forward with his line about financial instability, about a teacher's salary being insufficient for a growing daughter's needs, about my limited prospects. Harrison let him finish. He's fair like that. Always was. Even bleeding out on a floorboard at 26, he'd asked me twice if the rest of the team was okay before he asked about himself. Then Harrison turned to the exhibits my attorney submitted. 11.5 years of uninterrupted support payments. 2 teaching certifications. A record clean enough to squeak. 6 years of school involvement documented in emails, sign-in sheets. A robotics trophy with Lily's name on the plaque beside mine. You should have listened to your daughter, I said, when it was finally my turn to speak, and I said it looking straight at you, not at the judge. Not loud, not for the room, just for you. She told you who I was, every single day, in 100 small ways. You just never thought her word carried enough weight to change your mind. You didn't answer. You didn't have an answer. Harrison Voss made a note on his legal pad and didn't look up for a long moment, and I understood, watching him, that some debts really do get settled on a random Tuesday, whether you're ready for them or not. Here's what happened after, Vanessa, in case your attorney softened it on the drive home. Judge Voss issued his ruling 11 days later. Primary physical custody to me. Standard visitation for you, contingent on completing the parenting coordination sessions he ordered, the same sessions your attorney had, ironically, requested for me. He was careful, in his written opinion, not to make it about our history. He made it about the record, consistency, documented involvement, financial reliability, a home Lily herself, interviewed privately, called the calm one. He didn't need to mention the road, or the medevac bird, or the 3 frozen seconds when you didn't know what to say. The paperwork did what the paperwork was always going to do, once someone finally looked at it honestly. You lost more than custody hours that day. You lost the story you'd been telling yourself, and everyone in your orbit, for years, the one where I was the diminished half of our marriage, the cautionary tale, the man who peaked at 26 and spent the rest of his life fading. That story required you to never really look at me. The moment Harrison Voss stood up in that courtroom, the story stopped being yours to control. Lily still calls you every Wednesday, because I made sure of that, because whatever you are to me now, you're still her mother, and I didn't fight this to win a war against you. I fought it because a judge finally asked the right question, and the truth had been sitting there the whole time, waiting for someone to check. You've since told your sister a different version. I hear that the judge was compromised, that it wasn't a fair hearing. It was the fairest hearing either of us has ever had. You just weren't the one it was fair to. I think about that recess sometimes. Harrison, straightening his robe, glancing at me once before the bailiff called the room back to order, not with pity and not with favoritism, just with the quiet acknowledgement of a man who remembered exactly what quiet men can carry. You spent 9 years deciding I had nothing left. It took him about 4 seconds to remember what I'd never stopped being. You called me washed up in front of a judge who owed me his life and didn't even know it when he walked into that courtroom that morning. I didn't correct you when you said it. I let the record correct you instead. That's the last thing I'll say to you. Vanessa, you had 6 years of a daughter telling you the truth about her father, and you needed a stranger from a road overseas to make you finally sit still long enough to hear it. If this one hit close to home, if you've ever been counted out by someone who never bothered to ask what you'd actually built, tell me your story in the comments. I read every one.